Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual Hammer Museum, coming to you live from Los Angeles. I'm Claudia Bester, and I'm the Director of Hammer Public Programs. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Hammer Forum on the recent Supreme Court decision on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. Before we get started, I have a few notes for the audience. This program is being conducted via Zoom webinar, and in a Zoom webinar, we cannot see you in the audience and we cannot hear you. We can just see your names and anything that you type into the chat box and the Q&A box, which are at the bottom of your screen. We'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box and tell us where you're tuning in from. The chat is also an area where the audience can all talk to each other, and the Q&A box is where you type in questions you have for the panelists. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be available later on the Hammer website. Also, if you'd like to receive reminder emails about our upcoming events, please sign up for our email list on the Hammer website. And you can also find recordings of most of our past public programs on the website as well. So on to today's program. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with support from the Rosenblum family. 11 days ago, on June 18th, the US Supreme Court blocked the Trump administration's plan to dismantle the Obama-era Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, that has protected 700,000 so-called dreamers from deportation. So what does this mean? Is it definitive, or is this just a temporary stay? And where do we go from here? We have three guest speakers today. All are directly connected to the DACA program through their work, their activism, and/or through their personal histories. Yahaira Carrillo Rosales is a queer Mexicana chingona, a formerly undocumented activist. She's been organizing for social justice through community, policy, and creative interventions since 2007. In 2009, she founded the Kansas-Missouri Dream Alliance, which works to help undocumented youth in their transition from high school to college by connecting them with resources in the community. In May of 2010, Yahaira was one of 5 students who staged a sit-in inside Senator John McCain's Tucson office to call attention to the DREAM Act, which was the first known instance of civil disobedience by undocumented people. And at that time, it was unheard of for undocumented people to out themselves. So a really incredibly courageous act. Yahaira continues to believe that individuals affected by social injustice should share their rich and complex stories through organizing and art. She's also passionate about language justice, and she graduated from Mills College with an MFA in literary translation. She now freelances as a translator and interpreter for many movement organizations, in addition to her job as administrative coordinator at Grassroots Global Justice. Prerna Lal is a leading scholar and expert on immigration law and policy, and the author of Unsung America: Immigrant Trailblazers and Our Fight for Freedom. They were born in the Fiji Islands and came to the United States with their parents when they were 14 and grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Formerly an undocumented immigrant, Lal was integral in the establishment of advocacy networks led by undocumented youth and mobilized thousands of undocumented immigrants into pushing for the Federal DREAM Act in 2010 and winning the now popular DACA program. Lal also helped with the creation of many local immigrant youth groups, providing direct support, mentorship, and advocacy to individuals caught up in the immigration dragnet. As an undocumented law school graduate, Lal was among the first in the country to obtain a license to practice law. Their high-spirited activism also made them a target of the US government, who sought to deport them, but Lal won lawful permanent residency after a long court battle, and in April 2018, Lal became a United States citizen. As a nonprofit policy attorney in Washington, D.C., Lal worked at Asian Americans Advancing Justice to craft federal policies such as extended DACA, DAPA, temporary protected status for Nepal, and parole in place for the family members of Filipino war veterans. Most recently, Attorney Lal served as the sole immigration counsel for over 500 students and their family members at UC Berkeley, single-handedly creating and sustaining the first school-based legal services program in the United States. At the East Bay Community Law Center and UC Berkeley School of Law, Lal taught at the Immigration Law Clinic and mentored a new generation of public interest law students. Lal has previously contributed to books such as Undocumented and Unafraid and The Country I Call Home. They own and manage their own law firm, Lal Legal, where they continue to serve immigrants and shape immigration advocacy. Marielena Hincapié is the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center, or NILC, and the NILC Immigrant Justice Fund. Hincapié has more than 2 decades of experience in the immigrant rights movement and has litigated key cases in defense of immigrant workers, including Contreras versus Corinthian Vigor Insurance Brokerage, which established the legal precedent making it illegal for employers to retaliate against undocumented workers who exercise their workplace rights. She also litigated other key cases at the intersection of immigration and labor law. Recognized as a seasoned strategist and bridge builder, Hincapié has led national policy campaigns such as the creation and successful implementation of DACA. And under her leadership, NILC has been at the legal forefront of the fight to stop President's attempt to end DACA, representing DACA recipients and Make the Road New York in a case currently awaiting a decision by the Supreme Court. I think that's old. Hincapié currently serves as co-chair of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on Immigration. As an immigrant from Colombia, Hincapié brings a bilingual and bicultural perspective to her work in the social justice movement. Our moderator tonight is Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson. Levinson studies the law of the political process, including election law and governance issues, and her work focuses on ethics, political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. She regularly appears as a legal and political expert on television and radio and in print. She's the host of the new podcast, Passing Judgment, and has a weekly legal segment on NPR member station KCRW here in Los Angeles. She's also an op-ed contributor for NBC.com and the associate director of Loyola Journalist Law School. Professor Levinson served as the president of the Los Angeles Ethics Commission until 2018, and she is the founding director of Loyola Law School's Public Service Institute, which is dedicated to creating the next generation of leaders in government service. So, hello and welcome, Professor Levinson.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you all for joining and for joining this amazing panel. We had a little kind of pre-chat in our virtual green room, and I can honestly say I'm so excited for this discussion. And we're going to focus today on DACA and what's happening in the Supreme Court. But of course, we're going to touch on broader themes. Our national immigration policy is obviously something that's deeply important to so many members of our community. And it's something that is going to be at the forefront of the next presidential election. And we see these issues in the news all the time. There are new and more stringent restrictions on those who can seek asylum. There's news with respect to whether or not child immigrants will be free from detention centers and what we can do and I want to end with what we can do to help them. And then of course, at the forefront, what we are going to focus on today is DACA, how it got to the Supreme Court, what happened in the court, and more importantly, maybe what is going to happen next? Where are we going forward? So briefly, could we call up the slides? I'm a law professor, so I can't really do this with no slides, but I promise it's going to be really quick because we have a fantastic panel. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is just a little bit about DACA. It was enacted by President Obama as an executive order, and we'll talk about that in 2012. DACA is almost exactly 8 years old, 8 years and 16 days. And it, in very broad terms, means that President Obama directs the Department of Homeland Security not to deport certain undocumented youth who came to this country as children. The requirements for DACA are listed under the second bullet point. This PowerPoint will be available to people who will be part of the recording that's on the Hammer website. And I think I'm not going to read all of it, except to say that Dreamers, the group of people who can benefit from DACA, is actually a fairly small segment. It's a small sliver of the overall immigrant population for whom we still don't have legislative protections or protections via executive orders. So the next slide, if we could call that up, talks about the legal issues before the Supreme Court. And I'm going to raise those here really briefly, and then we'll talk about it with the panel. So the first question was whether or not judges could even consider whether President Trump's decision to end DACA was permissible or not, which is another way of saying, was it judicially reviewable, or did the Department of Homeland Security just get to say, we're ending DACA and that's that. Judges, you don't get to weigh in. The Supreme Court said, yes, it's judicially reviewable. And then the second question, and this was kind of the big meaty question, did President Trump's administration, and specifically Department of Homeland Security, give legally sufficient reasons for wanting to end DACA? And the answer to that was no. And then, of course, the big question looming is what's next? So if we could bring down the slides and bring in the panelists. Let's see, can I see, there's our panelists. I see we're coming up slowly, and I'm going to ask the panelists publicly, just as I did privately. I'm going to beg patience with name pronunciation. It's something that I am embarrassed about, and I will do my best. So, as I said, a huge important topic, huge political implications, huge legal implications, but what I want to actually lead with, and Yahaira, let's go to you first. This is a deeply human problem in the sense that immigration policy is not some academic exercise. It affects people who are members of our community and members of this panel deeply on a daily level, on a daily basis. So I want to start by first asking you to tell us a little bit about your background. And we heard it a little bit in the introduction, but a little bit about your work regarding immigrants, and specifically, again, your story.
Thank you. Yeah, so I actually came to the United States in 1992. I was 7 years old at the time, and I was undocumented. So I think it's important to note that at this point, I'm no longer undocumented, but I was undocumented for 21 years of my life. And as an undocumented young person, I was faced in my teen years with the reality that in Missouri, I couldn't access higher education because you can't, go to college here. It's still a case with a lot of folks. It's like you have social security number or you don't, and that either lets you in or it doesn't. So I didn't have access to education. I was deeply depressed and I had to try to figure out a way. And I found a private school that I was able to attend, a private Catholic school. And it was really based on that indignation that I decided to organize. I found it unacceptable, right? Having grown up in the United States, being spoon-fed all these narratives of the land of opportunity and then being confronted with the reality of that not being the case, I felt indignant and it felt unfair. And I didn't want anyone else to suffer through that. So that's why I started organizing and eventually founded the Kansas Missouri Dream Alliance, which is an organization that is still going on without me for several years now in Kansas City. And it really speaks to the importance of that and to the fact that it's been around for over a decade, so it really continues to speak to, despite the advances, we're still facing the same kind of challenges. And I personally connected through my local work to the national work in 2007, which led me to what was mentioned in my bio, which was the mass mobilization by undocumented young people in 2010, including civil disobediences, right? And that really stemmed from a desire to take back our agency. I can speak personally to conversations that I had on the Hill with legislators, with nonprofit leaders, and being told, well, we're here to protect you, to speak for you, and that they'd been working on immigration for decades, right? Because it's not something new. People are like, I've been working on immigration for 30 years. And at the time I was like, well, obviously something's not working if we're still in the same place, which is what led a lot of us to be like, enough is enough. You don't get to speak for us. We get to speak for ourselves. And if we're the ones facing being uprooted from a country that we've been raised in, we deserve to fight and to determine what terms we leave this country on. And so that's what led to those mass mobilizations in 2010, right? So, and that's what eventually led to DACA in 2012. It was over 2 years of very direct, confrontational, multi-tactic in the within the system and outside the system tactics that allowed us that win, if you will, at that time. And unfortunately, I was denied DACA back then. And I was able to receive status actually through a U visa, which is a more complex way for victims of crimes. So I often like to talk about it bluntly as the shittier your life is, kind of the more possibilities that you might have to find some sort of pathway. And I find that really disillusioning. It speaks to not seeing the humanity. It's like someone has to be in really dire straits to even have a sliver of a chance, and it's still not even a guarantee. And so since then, I've continued to advocate and support the community to really be there in the best way that I can through, since direct action organizing, also doing arts organizing, right? Changing the culture, changing the narrative at a story level, right? The power of stories, the power of art, and its impact in the world, as well as through language justice, access, right? How do we get people to access the conversations that are happening at national levels in a language that is understandable to them?
Yeah, that really helps put it in context. And we're going to pick up on a lot of those issues in a minute, mainly how hard we had to, or I shouldn't say we, how hard people had to push to get DACA, which was a incomplete victory in many ways. Prerna, I want to ask you the same question.
Hi, I'm Prerna. My family migrated from Fiji back in '99, right before the millennium, actually. And I was 14 going on 15, probably not the best age just to bring anybody to the US. A really difficult time as a teenager to move to a whole new country. Fiji actually happens to be COVID-free right now. So, we wonder about our decisions 20 years ago. But anyhow, so I wasn't actually undocumented at first. We came on visas. We have a lot of family here in the US, and soon realized that there was no going back. I thought I was going to be here for a few months turned into years. And I eventually did fall out of status right after 9/11, actually, at a time during when there was a lot of crackdown on international students and immigrants. So at that point, I became the only member of my family to not have papers, and had a totally different experience than my parents or my sibling, and began a sort of a different path for myself, because while they were able to work and have a living and drive and do all kinds of things, I had to struggle to even go to school or be able to drive or get any kind of healthcare, get any kinds of benefits of any kind, or even be able to work. So that was difficult. I was helped quite a bit because we were in California, and we had institutional laws on the books, so that was helpful in terms of getting through community college and state schools. It only came when it came to law school, though. That was hard, because even law schools at the time didn't know if we could get a license to practice law, or whether we could even be admitted to law school, and whether this was a character issue that me being out of status. And then obviously I was drawn to law because I found myself on the outskirts of the law, having done sort of nothing wrong besides just following my parents, going to school, and going about my day. So that was an interesting experience that I don't really wish on anyone. And soon became, after getting a graduate degree and still not being able to work, soon becoming involved in just conversations with other undocumented young people to push for some sort of legislation like the Federal Dream Act, to get it passed so that we could finally start living full lives in the US, which is sort of a country where a lot of us have grown up in. And for some of us, the only country we know is home. For others, of course, we have other homes, but for the time being, found ourselves here. So that's how it began. That's how I met Yahaira, through just national organizing on the DREAM Act, as well as civil disobedience actions. And soon found myself at the center of it, as well as being faced with deportation. In 2011, while I was finishing my first year of law school, I received a notice to appear in proceedings to be removed from the country. And for the first time, this became a reality, like, oh, I could be deported back to a place where I don't really have any family anymore for the most part. So, but thanks to DACA and thanks to all the organizing around by undocumented youth, deferred action was a possibility, as well as closing the case and being able to move forward with my life. And as it happened, when DACA was announced, I was eligible for it, but a few months after that, I think at least a year after that, Supreme Court also thankfully did away with Section 3 of DOMA, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, which allowed me to marry my same-sex partner and get a green card through that. So I was able to finally get my green card as well, not through DACA, but some other processes, which is true for, I think, at least in my legal work, about 30% of DACA recipients are able to have other pathways to citizenship, actually. So DACA was a great tool, not just to give people a temporary status, but also to screen undocumented young people for other benefits that they could qualify for, actually. So now I continue practicing immigration law and helping people like me and from different walks of life, and that is very fulfilling.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding us again that this is not an academic exercise when we talk about immigration policy. And for me, I want to go to you, Marielena, next. For me, immigration policy is such a story of congressional failure and of thwarted dreams by presidents. So it's both President Obama's thwarted dream and, frankly, at this point now, it's President Trump's thwarted dream as well. And I wanted to go back specifically to DACA and ask you about a little bit of the background of how did we end up with DACA? How did that end up being the compromise? Again, we know DACA is an executive order. It's not legislation. Mm-hmm. Why did Congress fail to act? Why did President Obama decide he had to act?
Great. Thank you for the invitation to be part here. It's actually a great honor to be with Yahaira and Prerna. So first of all, I'll share that as an immigrant myself from Colombia, I know we came in the 1970s when the immigration laws were different. And my family, the only difference between immigrant youth with DACA and myself, or so-called dreamers and myself, is I had the great privilege of coming with that little piece of paper that's called a green card that isn't even green, that allowed my 9 brothers and sisters and I to get on a pathway to citizenship and to now be naturalized and to have the honor of leading a national organization that's fighting for low-income immigrants and for the future of our country and our democracy. And it's that failed leadership that you just mentioned that we've seen from administration, Republican and Democrat, right, for over 25 plus years that we've had any significant major immigration reform that actually recognizes the role of immigrants in this nation. So I do want to come back to that conversation because there is a broader failed leadership. And the question about how DACA came about, you heard it from Yahaira and Prerna, right? We got DACA because immigrant youth fought for and won this policy, which is, in my mind, this is the most significant immigration policy victory. And I would even dare to say it's one of the most significant progressive policy victories fought for and won by the very people directly impacted by this. And it speaks to that courage and that leadership that immigrant youth like Yahaira and Prerna and so many other people, including folks like Karina, who is watching. I saw her on the chat from Phoenix, Arizona. Folks that have showed a level of leadership and courage that our policymakers have not had, right? That presidents have not had. I think about Martin Batalla, our named plaintiff in our case that went up before the Supreme Court that was just decided a couple of weeks ago. They were so courageous as a queer young man growing up in Queens. He is as Queens as there is. He's just as Queens and as a New Yorker as Trump is. They grew up in the same neighborhood. But Martin was courageous enough and decided to sue the Trump administration from the very beginning, which is why we were able to, within 3 hours of Trump announcing on September 5th of 2017 that he was going to terminate DACA, we were able to sue right away because courageous young people once again said, no, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to fight back. And that's how we won this most recent battle. And, in terms of how it came about, it's the incredible level of organizing. Yahaira was sharing earlier, we at the National Immigration Law Center have been working on this issue, this specific issue of DREAM, since 2001. So we're talking about almost 2 decades. We helped to draft the first DREAM Act because even back then we were fighting campaigns, mini campaigns on behalf of every individual young immigrant who was at risk of being deported, and some who actually did get deported back then. And it was in 2007 when there was another legislative failure, when immigrant youth basically said, you know what, we're tired of this. This legislative strategy isn't working, and decided to basically start doing incredible level of organizing and saying and inside the Beltway strategy hasn't shown us. It's shown that it's not, that it's unsuccessful. And so the level of organizing that both Prerna and Yahaira and many, many others have led across the nation, the narrative change, the civil disobedience, the inside-outside strategy, the storytelling, right, and helping people understand who they are and that they are as American, as their peers, right? That is really what brought about DACA. And when President Obama ultimately decided to exercise his executive authority to do what every law enforcement agency does, this wasn't actually an executive order. He directed the Department of Homeland Security to issue an agency policy exercising, at the time, it was then Secretary Napolitano, who's now president of the UC system, who basically decided to exercise what's called prosecutorial discretion.
Yeah.
Law enforcement agent in the country does, right? This is the same thing that a law enforcement officer does on the highway when they see somebody speeding. They're not going to go. They make a decision not to prosecute somebody who's going after like 5 miles above the speed zone, but instead go against somebody who's driving erratically and who may be endangering other drivers. That is prosecutorial discretion. DACA is prosecutorial discretion as well. And it was that legal theory that after a lot of advocacy, and we had the great honor of working closely with many of the immigrant youth leaders to convince the administration that the president had that authority and he should exercise it because Congress was failing to act.
Yeah, it's and thank you for the correction. I mean, it's essentially saying we're going to prioritize certain people for deportation. We're not going to prioritize other people. And of course, how you determine that priority ladder is deeply important for people's lives. And Yahaira and Prerna, I know that you were both involved in pushing Congress to take action on the DREAM Act. I want to stay with DACA for a minute, and Yahaira, go to you. Could you tell us a bit about what the reaction was I don't know how to describe this except to say the immigrant community, and specifically the community that could benefit from DACA after President Obama's announcement?
Yeah, so I think before jumping to your question, I do want to say that we would also be remiss not to talk about how we got to DACA at all if we didn't talk about the legacy we have of organizing in this country, right? Really founded upon the lessons from like the civil rights movement, particularly in this moment of Black folks uprising, of community uprising. It's really important to ground it in both the civil rights history there and subsequently the LGBTQ history. Many of us that were front and center in the organizing at the time, we're and are queer folks, right? So it's really this intersection of our identities, and it really comes from, standing on those shoulders, following in that legacy. Of course, we don't always succeed, but it's important to connect it to a bigger thing, right? It's not just about migrant rights. It's about this broader push for overall our communities that have been oppressed for a very long time. And when you think about that in terms of the current DACA decision and the reaction, I think, and at the time, how people felt when it was enacted, it was really a double-edged sword, right? With any win, it feels like you kind of win, and you also don't win everything, right? So on the one hand, you have this effort that has led to something like this kind of memo, this prosecutorial discretion coming about, which no one could have foresaw, right? We didn't know what this was going to turn into when we started pushing all of our really intense tactics, our direct action tactics, that we would get to that point. But we did. And so there was a level of celebration at the fact that we could achieve something of that magnitude, being people who in essence had everything going against us, right? We were in such a precarious situation. We could be booted at any time, to put it bluntly. And then we had won this thing. But on the other hand, what that also meant was that we had to put ourselves willingly into the system, right? We had to give over our addresses. We had to give over our pictures. We had to give over our fingerprints. We had to put ourselves directly now into the hands of the people that we had been trying to protect ourselves from, right? So when this was enacted, there was a lot of conversation that I remember people talking about, like, is it safe? Will they then use this list to come after us? And at first, I vaguely remember saying this was not going to be shared broadly, and later out, it's like, of course, it's a list. It's there. They're going to access it, and they can do whatever the heck they want with it, was the reality, right? And so we wanted to make sure that people were going into this knowing, right? It's a knowing of, it's a something, but is not really going to give you all of the rights that you're looking for. It is temporary, it is precarious, but it did allow folks to be able to advance in their lives, right? I have a lot of colleagues, friends that have DACA now. They've been able to advance in their careers, and in states like California, practice law, practice medicine, become therapists, or be in grad school. Like, I have really dear friends that are trying to become therapists to give back to the community in that way, because mental health is also such a big thing, right? When you live in a constant state of fear, that it's not just to the immigrant community. We see it spans across. It's in the Black community, it's in the Asian community. It's something that can happen, a trigger, and you just never know which community is going to be attacked at the moment. It was just a little bit of protection and a little bit of room to breathe, right? Especially for folks that were getting into their late 20s, early 30s, like some of us were at the time. And for young people, especially when it was enacted, it was not having to go through those panics and fears that I remember going through in high school. Like, I was in a deep depression. What was I going to do with my life? Young people who came up out of high school right after DACA have not experienced an adulthood without, some level of protection. So this SCOTUS decision was, and the continuing sort of kicking the can down the curb for a while, was really a point of tension and stress on so many levels for the community.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting this in the context of broader movements as well, broader civil rights movements, and explaining how much obviously this would affect every day of your life if you're wondering what your status is going to be and what you can legally do and what your profession could be, what your job can be. So I want to move from as a professor, I can't stop giving guideposts, talking about how we got to DACA and then what the reaction was. And then I want to move on to our current president and talk about a little bit about President Trump. So Prerna, I'd like to talk to you in a moment about rhetoric that we heard from President Trump, what he said throughout his campaign. And then Marielena, I want to get to the case and talk that out with you. And then I have about 27 other questions in now I see only 23 minutes to get to. So no worries there at all. We'll have parts 3, 4, or 2, 3, and 4 of this Hammer Forum in the next few days. So Prerna, I did want to talk about this with you for a moment. What was President Trump's rhetoric like throughout about DACA? We know what his rhetoric was with respect to immigration policy more generally when he was candidate Trump and then when he was President Trump. And specifically, we know he kind of dared Congress and said, I'm going to end this program, do something. And then Congress again failed to act. And so what was the effect of his statements on the immigrant community, and how worried were people, frankly, throughout his candidacy and the beginning of his presidency?
Yeah, we sort of never knew what we were getting with Trump. I mean, some people did, to be fair. He was, he ran a pretty racist campaign. He has a base he placates to. It's either white nationalists or white supremacists. We know his entire rhetoric has been pretty anti-immigrant since he was a candidate till today. So that's no surprise there. On DACA, though, he seemed to be open to let it either be a policy and on other days end it. So nobody knew what was coming. There was a lot of anxiety and in the community, as well as just not knowing how to plan for the future. So while some advocates were saying not to renew your DACAs because he might threaten people with deportations, others were saying let's just wait and watch. But yeah, I mean, and he sort of kept DACA for a little bit when he came into office. I mean, advanced parole was the best thing to go. Advanced parole is a way to travel abroad and come back if you have DACA for certain reasons. That was the best thing to go. Muslim ban was the best thing enacted, and then a slew of other anti-immigrant, anti-asylum policies, obviously. And then Trump didn't get to DACA until he was threatened with a lawsuit by his own base. There were 10 attorney generals, 10 different states that sued or threatened to sue the administration to stop the DACA program and call it unlawful. And that's when the administration sprung into action and decided through a memo that they would try to end it. So that's how it came about, at least the attempts to end the DACA program. And it's still been 4 years into his presidency, and it's still around. So that says a lot. As far as Congress failing to act, I mean, it comes back to the lack of leadership and the fact that we haven't had meaningful immigration reform of any kind since the 80s in this country, and that both parties are responsible for failure for that to happen. And I don't think there was much appetite on the part of Congress, at least, to do anything about immigration, at least not with Trump in the office either. So yeah, that's how Congress failed to act and continues to fail to act.
Thank you. And that brings us, of course, to the Supreme Court, because we didn't have legislation in place. There was no federal protection, despite, again, 2 presidents saying, do something. President Obama is saying, we need something or else I'm going to enact this policy. And President Trump saying, we need something or else I'm going to wind down this policy. And Marielena, let's talk about first, what do we think President Trump's motivations were? So Prerna just talked about the fact that really nothing happened until Republican state attorney generals started to sue and say DACA is not legal. So do we feel that there was a motivation of, I don't want to defend this program I don't like anymore? Or was this more of a policy and politics decision of, I ran on a platform of stricter immigration regulation, and that's what I'm going to do by ending DACA?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was completely political and based on the president and candidate Trump's decision to run on white nationalist policies, anti-immigrant policies. And he was never actually threatened. That was my belief, is that someday discovery will show that it was all coordinated between the White House, the Department of Justice under Sessions probably, and the state AGs, which were all Republican. And so the threat, that was a fabricated deadline. The letter by the Attorney General, state Attorney Generals, basically said, if you don't terminate DACA by X date, we will sue you. And then he felt like, oh, I have to terminate DACA. Absolutely not. He had no reason to terminate DACA, but that gave the White House the political leverage to say, we are terminating because we have no choice, poor us. And on the other hand, then using DACA and using DACA recipients really as a bargaining chip to try to get a broader, more radical anti-immigrant agenda through Congress, which he hasn't been able to do, fortunately. But what he has done is, if you listen to the rhetoric, Trump from day one has talked about undocumented immigrants. He's talked about, Mexican immigrants as rapists and anti-Muslim and gang members and bad hombres and the works. But if you look at the actual policies he has passed, every single one of them have been meant to restrict legal immigration. DACA, temporary protected status, Muslim ban, family separation, blocking people from legally applying for asylum, as they're both right under domestic and international law. And so this administration, DACA is just one piece of a larger strategy, which they have been trying to use immigration as a way, frankly, to radically reshape who we are as a country and who is worthy of being an American, who defining what it means to be an American, and who can come in the future and who gets to stay in this country. And that is actually, just to bring it back to the Supreme Court decision, one of the reasons it's such a victory, again, is first and foremost because it was fought for and won by immigrant youth. Second is although it is a temporary victory, and I want to get back to that as well. The fact is that the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 majority conservative court, in a decision written by the Chief Justice himself, has allowed immigrant youth with DACA to stay here. And it does recognize that immigrant youth, this is their home and this is where they should remain. And now the political fight continues, that what ultimately is needed is a permanent solution where the law recognizes
Yahaira and Prerna, can you still, are you still with me?
Yes.
Okay, so that wasn't, I just want to make sure that that wasn't my internet. And
Okay.
so we'll get Marielena back in a moment. I was actually going to take that moment to give her permission to turn on the light switch if she wanted to, because I think the sun set in the background during the course of the panel. So I will go ahead and pick up where I was going to ask her, which is, and I think that we'll be fine until she gets back on. Ultimately, President Trump does decide to act, and he directs the Department of Homeland Security to, for lack of a better term, start unwinding DACA. And there were two issues that came up before the Supreme Court, as I said before, but I'll repeat them because I've learned in my years in the classroom that sometimes that's a decent idea. And the first one was, can judges even review the Department of Homeland Security's decision to end DACA? Meaning, was this a policy decision or was this a legal decision? And the court ultimately decided, yes, we belong here. And if we think about it, I just want to say as a side note, think of how much that would have upended our understanding of how much power executive agencies have. If the Department of Homeland Security could make decisions that were not reviewable by a federal court, that really would have a ripple effect and repercussions far beyond DACA. And then the second question, which was the one I think most people focused on, is, did the Department of Homeland Security comply with the Federal Administrative Procedures Act? Now, if some of the people listening at home are having a little deja vu about hearing me say Federal Administrative Procedures Act, it's because it's the same federal law that was at issue in the census case last year. I'll be very quick on this. The census case asked whether or not the Department of Commerce could add a citizenship question to the census. And the issue really came down to whether or not the Trump administration had complied with the Federal Administrative Procedures Act, meaning, did they give a real reason, a good enough reason, a legally sufficient reason for wanting to add that question? Or was their decision arbitrary and capricious? Why do I spend some time on that? Because it's the same issue with respect to DACA. It's the same statute. Again, we're looking at the Federal Administrative Procedures Act. And again, we're looking at, did the Trump administration comply with it? Prerna, if it's okay, I know we didn't plan this, but if it's okay, could I ask you to walk through why the majority said, essentially, Trump administration, we don't buy it. You did not comply with the Federal Administrative Procedures Act. You failed to comply with federal law.
Yes. So, I mean, to the first question, it's pretty clear that very few things are not reviewable by the Supreme Court. They can review most executive decisions, especially on immigration issues. So that was sort of a no-brainer on that, because if the court had ruled that they couldn't review it, then they couldn't review many other different things. So that didn't seem to make any sense. As far as the Admin Procedures Act goes, the APA in short, it's basically a rule for regulations, right? And how regulations are enacted in the US, and how there has to be some sort of notice and comment period given anytime an agency substantively changes a rule or performs an agency action, to give people who rely on the agency and rely on rules to give feedback and act upon it, right? What Trump did in terms of ending DACA was have Acting Secretary Elaine Duke at the time just write a memo saying effective immediately and immediately, basically, DACA is ending. We are not going to accept any applications for initial DACAs, and we are only giving till October, I think a month more to get in renewals, and that is it. And that was the only thing. There was no feedback period from the public. There was basically no period given to DACA recipients and beneficiaries to give them time to wrap up their affairs and make other plans and so on and so forth. So that is known as arbitrary and capricious in terms of legal making, as in there's a substantial group of people, in this case 800,000 people, who rely on this program to go about their lives, and to just suddenly wake up one day and be told this is unlawful, you can't have this anymore, without any kind of feedback, any kind of comment, any kind of rulemaking, is a violation of the APA, and that's why the Supreme Court ruled the way it did.
That's a perfect explanation. It's so clear as to exactly what the legal issue is here, right? And therefore, because the court said this is arbitrary and capricious, and what does this mean? Well, I'll ask in a slightly narrower way. Do we think that this president can still end DACA? Prerna, if I could stay with you on this for one moment.
Yes, of course. The court never said that DACA was legal or not legal. The court didn't make that decision in this case. All it said was that the way in which the administration ended DACA was a violation of the APA. But if the administration just follows proper procedures, as in publishing a notice in the register and allowing feedback, and then ends DACA in that way, then yes, it can do that. So yes, the administration, if it just follows proper procedures like under the APA, they can definitely end the program.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I see everybody's thinking, Chief Justice John Roberts, is he suddenly a liberal jurist? And I think the answer is absolutely not. And, he joined with the liberals on the court with respect to the LGBTQ decision, dealing with the Civil Rights Act, which Hammer audiences we talked about just last week. And obviously with respect to DACA, and then recently with respect to abortion rights, although that was a very thin decision as well. And I would say, I think that this decision is largely Chief Justice John Roberts saying, I can't believe you're being so sloppy again, Trump administration. Don't come to my house with this piece of paper and, try and type this out. Use spell check, use grammar check. And so, Marielena, I'm glad to see you back. I'm so sorry about that. Everybody's a technology nightmare, right? That something's going to happen in the middle of a panel. So I just want to tell you, during when you were on the other side of the moon during the blackout period, Prerna and I talked about what the issues were in the Supreme Court, the two main issues. What the Supreme Court, a thin majority of the Supreme Court, ultimately decided. And so I know that we had kind of talked about discussing that with you, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity, if you wanted to weigh in on your thoughts on the majority opinion, or the separate opinions. And in fact, we haven't talked about Justice Sotomayor saying, I don't want to let this go. I think that this could have been animated by racial animus, and I want to put that in writing. So with that triple compound question, I'll give you a moment.
Sure, thank you, and apologies for that. So I think I would say a couple of things, and I heard Prerna's last piece. And, look, at the end of the day, we knew even back with Obama that he was exercising his executive authority to create this new policy change. A future president could end it, right? That has never been an issue, and that's one of the reasons that the issue before the Supreme Court was so narrow. As a reminder to folks, there is a separate case in Texas, which is the lawsuit from Texas against the administration. First in 2014, when the Obama administration announced the Deferred Action for parents of U.S. citizen children and green card holders, and Texas sued over DACA, and then that went up to the Supreme Court. It was 4-4. There was no decision. It was locked. So that program was not implemented. And then now the Texas case also then sued over DACA, and that the same day that the Supreme Court issued its decision just a few weeks ago, the Judge Hainan in the Texas court has asked for briefing now, and that is about the constitutionality and legality. So that case is also likely to potentially make its way up to the court. And unfortunately, we do believe that the Trump administration is likely to try to terminate DACA imminently. And so it once again reminds us that this was a temporary solution, and that ultimately the stakes are higher for this November election. We'll see what the Trump administration, how they try to terminate the DACA policy this time around, and we are preparing for litigation already in our case, and so it's unclear what how that will be implemented. But it does remind us that this November, and this is a reminder, I think, for everybody who's watching, is DACA recipients themselves may not be able to vote, but they have family members, loved ones, co-workers, employers, their business partners who can vote. And the only way that we're going to be able to ultimately get a permanent solution to this, and not just for young immigrants with DACA, but people with temporary protected status, for all of the workers who today are considered essential workers, well, it's time then for the law to recognize those essential workers as well, and immigrants for the positive role and the important role that they play and that we play in our society, and that the law needs to catch up with where the American public is, which is an overwhelming amount of support for DACA recipients and for immigrants in general as well.
Yeah, oh my God, I want to pick up on about 15 of those thoughts, but I see that it is 5:56 and that we have a number of questions. So I want to zoom ahead actually a little bit. And actually on that note, I want to apologize for my bad Zoom etiquette. I should be doing this the whole time. I'm obviously looking at my questions, looking at the chat, looking at the Q&A. So thank you everybody for hanging in there. So Marielena, you talked, I think we already covered this a little bit, the DACA related cases that are still pending before the courts. And the thing that I really wanted the audience to know, of course, is that there are still like full frontal legal challenges to DACA, and that the Supreme Court decision is obviously, I think, a victory for supporters of DACA, but potentially a temporary one, and there are other cases looming in the pipeline. So let's move on from the legal case, the Supreme Court case. Let's move on from what is working its way up through the court system. And then let's go to, because I don't want to leave people on this terrifically depressing moment before we get to questions, which is, let's imagine that the three of you, are lawmakers. What are some important steps that Congress could take? Because this does increasingly, as always, seem to be an issue of, we can't leave this to presidents. We can't leave this to administrations. There needs to be a legislative solution. So which we're not just worried, we've said this before, but I want to say it again, we're not just worried about dreamers. There's a much broader class of people, a much broader group of people who don't have protection. And so, Marielena, since we lost you for a little bit, let's stay with you on this one. What are the most important steps that Congress can take? I'll go around the room on this. I'll end my Q&A with what can members of the audience do? And then it looks like we already have 7 questions.
Of course. So I'll focus on 3 immediate solutions, frankly, that Congress can do in July, right? So immediately, and one of the things that members of the audience can do is call on your senators to make sure that they do that. So the first is the Senate has an opportunity to protect immigrant youth this July. The next COVID package must include an automatic extension of work permits and protection from deportation for immigrant youth, so the DACA recipients, and also those with temporary protected status that are at risk of losing their protection as well. Second is, and this is more in the context of what we're dealing with in the country right now, Congress has the opportunity to right some of the wrongs from just the last few months on the last COVID bill that President Trump signed into law, which excludes millions of immigrant families who are taxpayers, right? So part of the tax rebate that was included in the CARES Act explicitly excluded over 15 million immigrant families, right? And these are folks who are what we call mixed status families. So they may have US citizen family members. It's estimated that about 15.3 million immigrants. That includes 3.7 US citizen children that didn't get that tax rebate. So this is an opportunity, again, for the Senate in July to enact the HEROES Act, which includes that tax rebate, that essential economic relief for immigrant families. And it's important because you can't applaud essential workers and call them sheroes and heroes, and then on the other hand, exclude them from this very necessary relief that everyone needs in this moment. We need a recovery that is truly a recovery for all. And then last thing, again, in the immediate, is we need the Senate to act and ensure that everyone, regardless of their immigration status, has access to free COVID-19 testing, treatment, as well as rehabilitation and any of the services that they need, including a vaccine when we have a vaccine, and that needs to be done through emergency Medicaid so that everyone feels able to get the healthcare that they need, so that they can be safe, they can be healthy, we can be healthy. We're only going to come out of this crisis, the public health crisis and the economic crisis, if we're all healthy.
Yeah. It's hard to forget about that for a moment. And I'm glad that you brought that up. Yahaira, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. If you want to add to anything that Marielena just said on that issue.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about the investment that the government has made and continues to make in detention centers, right? In contracts with private entities that have turned the incarceration of migrants, of family, of children into a profit-making business. And I think it's important to not just think about what can we do to just protect migrants. It really goes down to the militarization of our country, right? The internal militarization of our country, the investment in police, right? Police that then cooperate with larger law enforcements, with DHS, with ICE, with CBP. It comes down to this very big and very real thing about where the money is going. It's tech companies that provide these kind of supports for, all this kind of tracking of everyone, people that are out in the world like protesting. So we have to connect the bigger picture. It's not, we can talk about sort of the singular, what can we do in the immediacy? But if we're not tackling the larger systemic problem, we will continue to come back to this place, right? And this is where it ties into the broader issue that we're facing in the moment, right? We continue to see also over-militarization impacting our Black brothers and sisters, impacting the community. And it's important to come together to kind of but to actually and literally start breaking those binds, right? There is a monetary enforcement. Politicians also get money from these companies, right? Because now companies and big corporations and big donors are allowed to make these insane contributions to political campaigns, it is a loop. It is a cycle. There's these broader things that have to be broken. And it's important for us to be educated. I mean, I'm still educating myself on all the pieces, and sometimes it feels really overwhelming, right? But there is a chain that you can follow and you can connect all of these dots. So we have to do that labor and realize that our joint liberation, our joint successes and wins really rely on not just focusing on one part of our communities and one segment of our country's population. We have to think bigger. We have to see systemically, and we have to tackle the issues at a systemic level as opposed to smaller wins. I think smaller wins are always important, but both have to happen. And sometimes we kind of get tied in this defensiveness. And unfortunately, like the folks that are against us have for many years moved forward in these sort of small ways to get us to these difficult places. And it's on us to also begin to chip at various levels and to also go to the root of these things. So
Yeah.
that's a really big piece.
Thank you. Prerna, I promised you an ability to weigh in on this as well. Obviously, a lot to pick up on, but the original question was, and you can really pick up wherever you'd like. Let's be honest. What are some specific steps that Congress should take?
I mean, I agree with Yahaira for the most part. And as far as specific things go, I would love to see, obviously a full legalization program for every single person who's here. That's been a pipe dream for a long time, but that is the goal. And some sort of way of ensuring that this doesn't keep happening, like some sort of statute of limitations on being undocumented or an updated registry whereby if you're here for, 1 year, 5 years without incident, you can just apply for a green card. You don't need anything besides that, presence in the US. I think it's important to stop creating cycles and people who are undocumented, people who keep living in the US because they're afraid if they ever leave to go back home, they can't come back, right? So instead of trapping people here, it should give them the right to basically stay and live and work here and to be able to freely travel when it is safe to do so. I think that is definitely something, and obviously to end detention and mass deportation programs. I think those are priority issues, or for me at least.
Yeah, for you and many, many others, of course. So let's try. I don't want to lose people before we get to their questions, because I know it can be hard to sit and not be sitting with us. And so I at least want to get that bit of interaction from you. And the first question actually is from my neighbor, but I did not ask her if it was okay to use her name. So I'll say she's a professor at a major university here. And Marielena, do not worry about this. I have lived that moment so many times. Please don't worry. So we're just moving on to Q&A a little bit. And so I'm gonna take moderator's privilege and start with my neighbor's question, which is, and again, she's a professor at a major university here. What effect will the DACA decision have on higher education, access to enrollment, to funding? What relation, if any, does the DACA decision have for international students? One of the reasons that universities are reluctant to return to in-person classes in the fall is because some of our foreign students and others can't get visas to return to the US. So again, I didn't ask her if I could use her name, so I'll just say thanks to my neighbor for that question. And Marielena, do you want to try that one, take that one first, or whoever wants to can take that?
Sure, I'll start. I think the first thing in terms of the impact of DACA on higher education has been critical, right? And in fact, one of our main partners in fighting for DACA, including at the Supreme Court, have been higher education professionals, presidents of universities, teachers, professors, and many DACA recipients are teachers themselves, right? So what we've seen is many DACA recipients have been able to finally go to higher ed. They've been able to afford. They have limitations in terms of the access to higher education in terms of financial aid and loans that they have. And a lot of it is also dependent on the particular schools. And I think Prerna talked about in-state tuition. is a big factor in all of that. The question, I think, with the Supreme Court's decision and allowing DACA to remain in place, and again, dependent on what happens with the Trump administration, in terms of if they actually pursue rescinding the DACA policy once again, the timing of that will potentially impact enrollment. DACA recipients will be needing to make decisions. And I think our job as lawyers is to make sure that people are making informed and empowered decisions about what's in their best interest and in their family's best interest. The second question about the international students, if I understand it correctly, I would say not much, because right, DACA recipients, they're part of the criteria is that they've been in the United States. They came when they were children, before 16, et cetera. They came prior to 2007. So for those international students that are abroad and want to apply to come here, DACA is not one of the programs. And we do know that universities are being hard hit by enrollment for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to my neighbors for always logging in and being so supportive. Prerna, we had a question from Addie that was specific to the U visa. So I think I'm going to email that to you if that's okay. And it was specific to an experience with the U visa and whether or not it's trackable. And so then we're going to go to Caro, who asks, a friend of mine is a dreamer and couldn't attend tonight. She asks, quote, my main question right now is if you can travel when DACA first came out, you had the protection and like TPS could travel to your home country and come back with no issues. I'm asking because that's all I need to try and get my citizenship.
I think the person's talking about the advanced parole. It's permission to leave and return to the U.S. That was granted to DACA recipients when the program was first announced. They could leave for educational reasons, employment reasons, and humanitarian reasons. And it was sort of a great program. The reason why a lot of DACA recipients were interested in advanced parole is because for those not brought to the U.S. lawfully, it gives them finally a lawful entry to use for future adjustment of status, green cards through family members, basically, usually spouses. But it makes the process much more simpler. I mean, the Trump administration saw this as a backdoor amnesty program is what they called it, even though it wasn't. And that's the first, loophole in quotes that they tried to close when they came into office. So as far as advanced parole, the program should technically be restored according to the Supreme Court decision, because the part of one of the lawsuits, the NAACP lawsuit that was up at the Supreme Court did address advanced parole and did ask the administration to fully restore the program. So in the meantime, it should be available. It has not been made available right now. USCIS has basically said, we don't agree with this decision from the Supreme Court, and it's lawless, or whatever else they want to say as a customer service agency interpreting the law. But they haven't made it available. I do know people who are applying for it and probably will litigate the issue. I think it's probably best to wait a little bit and just to get clearance to apply for it. But yeah, it should be available. But Trump can still take away DACA at any point in time. So I think people who are trying to go abroad or get advanced parole to go abroad should probably consult with an attorney before they do so.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a couple of questions on this issue, which isn't DACA related, but is certainly on people's minds. And I want to be sure to ask it. It's, and I actually led with this. What's going to happen to the children who are going to be released from the detention centers under Judge Dolly G's order? Where will they go? And in the question, what's asked is how can we help them? So oftentimes, we don't know, just based on reading a newspaper article, what steps we can take. Marielena, do you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll start. And actually I just wanted to add to what Prerna said about advanced parole. And this is actually true even of first-time applicants, which again, the Supreme Court decision on DACA basically restored DACA back to where it was in 2012, right? The original DACA policy. And yeah, because we're living in such a political moment and at a time under an administration that is so punitive, that is anti-immigrant, and that is retaliatory, it is especially important for people to make sure that they are consulting a reputable attorney, making sure that they're connecting to a local organization that they're organizing, and that they are then getting the information for them to make an informed and empowered decision about what they think is best, which could be, as an activist, to apply and then use that for litigation purposes. Other people may decide, you know what, let's hold off what happens even with the elections, but again, we want to make sure people are consulting legal counsel, especially in this moment that's so precarious. Again, we expect it's likely that the Trump administration will act relatively soon in terms of rescinding the program again, so being very conscious of that. And similarly, I would say the same thing with Judge G's incredibly important decision about these children. In any other circumstance, those children should be already released, right? As immediately following the judge's decision this week. And it's insane that in the United States in 2020 we should even need a judicial decision saying in this context of a public health crisis, these children should be released, they should be free, they shouldn't have been locked up to begin with, right? There needs to be an end to family detention and to detention, and as the first option to begin with. Like, family detention, children in particular, should not be locked up, period. And so in terms of what can be done right away is contact your senators, contact your members of Congress and your elected officials. They need to pressure the administration. Congress they hold the purse. They can actually put pressure and not allow the administration to use funding for certain things, and to block them and ensure that they actually follow and pursue the judge's decision. Now, will they? I don't know. I mean, to be honest, this administration has been clearly so cruel and does not care. They believe that they're above the law. They don't follow legal proceedings. They don't follow the rule of law. It's rather than the rule of law, really, they are the administration of chaos and cruelty. So what you all can do is make sure that you are leaning on your elected officials at the federal, state, and local level to put pressure on the administration. If they are released, they are going to hopefully be released to family members, and there will be a lot of work. So again, if you are in LA, there are lots of organizations here that can support you. There are groups like Carecen, for example, that is very involved in a lot of the groups. There's local kind office. I mean, we've got a richness of resources here locally that can help connect you to those families if you want to support in different ways.
Maybe I'll ask the Hammer if maybe under the, when we post the video, if maybe under the video, we could ask the panelists for some of their favorite organizations and resources. And if it's possible, and sorry, I didn't ask about this before, maybe we could create links to those so that they can live on for people who would like to know. And so when we started this conversation, I talked about that immigration is broader than just DACA, obviously. And we talked about briefly the topic we just discussed, which is children in the detention centers. And we also talked about the recent decision dealing with asylum seekers and, quote, rapid removal. And Perry asked a question on this, and I want to make sure that we get to it. What do the panelists think of the recent Supreme Court decision on, quote, rapid removal? In particular, the fact that Justices Breyer and Ginsburg sided with the majority. I can't tell from here who is nodding their head no or yes more vigorously. Prerna, do you want to take this one? No is an acceptable answer.
As far as the decision goes, I mean, it's not anything surprising from the Supreme Court. Just because they decided to keep DACA for the day doesn't mean that they are necessarily a Supreme Court that is empowered and liberal. So as far as the asylum decision goes, no surprises there, I think, at least from my read of it.
And what do we make of the second part of the question, that this was not a conservative versus liberal decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a shameful decision. I mean, simply put, right? This isn't a legal response. It reminds me very much of the Muslim ban, right? There are certain laws on our books, and the Supreme Court has once again given the green light. I mean, recently, same thing, public charge in February, the Supreme Court gave, and a majority of the justices once again allowed the Trump administration to start implementing one of the most dangerous rules that this administration has put in place, which we're now suffering with because public charge has created a chilling effect in people being able to come forward to seek healthcare, nutrition, housing, certain programs because they're afraid that they will be denied a green card and the ability to remain with their families. And so we see time and time again that the Supreme Court, including some of the quote unquote liberal justices, continue to side and allow the Trump administration to get away with laws that frankly should immediately be blocked instead. And I think that history will judge this Supreme Court just the same way that we have seen, whether it was with Japanese internment, whether it was a Dred Scott decision. We have a long, long history in this country where the Supreme Court has been on the wrong side of history.
So I know it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next week or so. Obviously, the Supreme Court still has some very big cases with very politically charged cases dealing with President Trump's tax returns and dealing with the issue of faithless electors, which I apologize. I've said so many times today that I may have already said during this panel. And so I do want to get back. Let's stay with the Supreme Court for a minute. Julie has a good question on the dissent. And so we talked about the majority in the Regents case, the DACA case. And we talked about the fact that the majority essentially said, you were too sloppy, go back, try, I'm not taking your homework. If you want to go home and redo it, I might look at it. But we didn't talk through what the dissent said. And so if one of you wants to pick up on, basically, I take Julie's question to mean in a sense of, if it was as sloppy as we're describing it, why were there members of the court that said, no, we're okay with that?
I think once again, this is, and I don't think it's limited to the Roberts Court, but we're seeing that the independence of the court that so many people have believed actually has been shown time and time again that there are serious questions about the integrity of the court and how impartial or how political the justices are. And that's why we keep on seeing 5-4 decisions, right? It's almost guaranteed that you can tell, depending on the issue, which direction they'll be. And of course, Justice Roberts is a little bit of that swing vote. It used to be Justice Kennedy, and now many of us who litigate really look at Justice Roberts, and he on social issues appears to be siding more on some quote unquote liberal issues. I don't look, as a lawyer, I will never try to guess how judges will come out. In fact, on our DACA case, I actually thought that we had a possibility of winning. And that said, I think the dissents show us what would happen if particularly the legal issues of the merits of the constitutionality of DACA would be before the court. We saw Sotomayor talking about the equal protection claim as well, which was one of the claims we had in our case. And so I think it raises flags and opportunities for the future. And I once again come back to the importance of the elections, right? In November, we've been moving more and more towards a much more conservative and right-wing court. This November election, the stakes are so high, and oftentimes people forget that it's not about just electing a president, it's about electing a president who then gets to nominate future Supreme Court justices that are with us for decades to come. And that really, truly is consequential for our democracy, it's consequential for immigrants, but for all of our civil rights and human rights.
Yeah, and to Julie's question, with respect to that federal law, the Federal Administrative Procedures Act, there was a minority of the court that said, essentially, the bar is so low that you have passed that bar. And that is the argument that goes on a lot when it comes to this question of, did you survive the Federal Administrative Procedures Act? It's kind of, is it just turning in the homework? Or is it that, it was typed and it was double spaced and you used the right margins? And Marielena, as you said, it's, that so many of these issues are mapped onto the idea that federal judges who have lifetime appointments obviously have different ideologies when it comes to legal ideologies, but still in some ways seem to bring their political ideologies. We saw that those two things did not map onto each other when it came to Justice Gorsuch writing the decision in the LGBTQ case, because he said, I'm a textualist and I'm looking at the text of the Civil Rights Act, and this is how you read that text. And so it's not always possible, but of course, we have a lot of 5-4 decisions because we have a court that is divided 5-4 based on whether or not a Republican or a Democrat appointed the members. Gosh, I think that we were already kind of 7 minutes over where I promised all of you that we would be. And so really quickly, David Smith asks a good question about how do we ensure, if we can at all, the issue of legality regarding DACA, that the issue of legality of DACA is brought to the Supreme Court's attention rather than just addressing Trump's actions against it. And I would say the Supreme Court can only take the cases that wind their way up to the court. And then, of course, it's incredibly important whether or not you have 4 votes. That's what it takes in the Supreme Court, 4 votes to take a case. And so the court can't on its own say, we really want to weigh in on X, Y, or Z. And so I think that we should, as you can tell, I would like to keep all 3 of you much, much longer. And I'm so grateful for your time, but I think we should end with a very quick resource guide for listeners. And Yahaira, I'm sorry, we haven't heard from you in a while. So if we could start with you, kind of what, if people want to have their "what can I do now" sheet, what would you put on it?
So I think I want to contextualize it in the moment, right? We find ourselves in a pandemic, a global health emergency, where we all have to assess the level of activation, if you will, that we can embark upon for our own safety, the safety of our loved ones. So prefacing with that, I think it stems from the smallest grain of rice type thing. For example, finding a documentary on your local public station to watch with your family, because we're all stuck in the house and we're all watching TV, right? So watch a documentary. There are really good ones on, we just finished watching the Asians in America series on PBS and had really rich discussion. And there's so much history that is really tied into Asian history around immigration. I think that's a key piece that folks don't realize, that a lot of the things that we take for granted, if you will, now, like birthright citizenship, really stem from the Asian American struggle for belonging in the United States based on what they've contributed to this country and being here, right? So there's like a minuscule thing that you can do, have a dialogue at home if you cannot be out there in the streets. If you can be out there in the streets, I think that this is a once in a lifetime, a historic moment to be out there and really join forces on the bigger issue, right? The systemic racism that we see across the country that's really embedded in our history and in our practices and in our systems, right? So part of getting immigration wins is also about fighting for racial justice. They are not separate. These things are intertwined, right? So if you can do the small thing, do the small thing. If you're an artist, it's important, contribute your art to the work. We're in quarantine. We read things, we watch things, we listen to things. As creatives, how are we contributing to creating the world that we want to live in, that we want our children and our loved ones to live in, right? So it spans the gamut. There isn't a one-way thing. It can't be said that, oh, well, because some undocumented folks did civil disobedience, I have to go lock myself up to an office somewhere. That isn't for everyone. And there's a variety of tactics that get us to where we're going. So I think that's a really important moment that folks need to decide, assess where they're at, and let's have those broader conversations. And I think part of winning is about changing the narrative, right? So that has to do with personal relationships. It's important to, even in quarantine, talk to our neighbors. It's important, if the only thing that you can do is put a sign up on your window, to tell your Black neighbors that Black Lives Matters and build a bond even through not speaking. I think that's really important. right? So there isn't a one-way thing, and in particular, because of this moment, we can't all take to the streets.
Yeah, Prerna, can we go to you next?
Yeah, I mean, I have not much to add to that. I think it's pretty clear to me, or at least from what Yahaira has said, that we don't live single issue lives, and we don't live in movements that are isolated from each other. The reality is that none of us probably would be here, at least the panelists, if it wasn't for the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. It would not. That's what led to the liberalization of Immigration and Nationality Act and the laws that are in the books today. And if it wasn't for the Civil Rights Movement, I definitely would not be here. So it's important to realize and that our struggles are interconnected and to lend support wherever we can. And again, a lot of people's energies are tapped out right now. There's not a lot everybody can do, but you just do what you can. I mean, there's a lot of resources on blacklivesmatter.com, on different websites, as to simple things from signing a petition to donating some money to again, joining a protest or figuring out how to vote, or using your social media to promote discourse that is helpful and not hurtful. So there's something everyone can do in small ways to sort of push the envelope forward.
Beautiful. Marielena, do you want to wrap us up here?
Sure. So I guess what I would say is, in this moment, when we are experiencing what I refer to as like the evil trio of the public health crisis, the economic crisis, and the racial injustices and violence that we're witnessing, we're being reminded of our interconnectedness and our interdependence. And that, as both Yahaira and Prerna talked about, like this is ultimately about narrative. This is ultimately about who we are as a nation, who is considered worthy of being here. And we as immigrants get to help shape the direction of our country. And this is why the Trump administration is trying to keep us from being here, trying to exclude us from coming, and trying to kick us out. And what people can do is, first and foremost, at a very personal level, is tell your story, right? Unless you are a Native American, unless you're indigenous, or come from enslaved African families, everyone has an immigrant story in this nation. And everybody moves as well. People move from city to city, from state to state, from country to country, and tell your story and make sure that you know your immigrant roots, that your family, your children, your classmates, your coworkers know your story, and write about your story. Tell your story in a local op-ed, and especially especially in these virtual forums that we have right now. Second is, you can work, whether you're working at home or doing it online, like you can call your members of Congress, whether it is to try to ensure that the children are freed from detention in this moment, from the jails that they're in, whether it is to make sure that your senators enact laws over the next couple of weeks. We're talking about the next couple of weeks are essential to make sure that everybody has access to COVID testing and healthcare, that DACA recipients and temporary protected status members can get that permanent protection that they need, at least for this extension. And then finally, I would say voting, right? Whether you are voting or making sure that others in your family and all of your loved ones are getting out to vote. This is not a time to sit by the sidelines. This is absolutely a time of activism, a historical moment in which we get to shape the direction of this nation. And so it's a time for activism.
Thank you. And let me say, if go vote doesn't necessarily have to mean go to a polling place. It can mean please request your vote by mail ballot if you have to request one, and please feel very comfortable filling it out. Okay, thank you. What an amazing panel. I'm so grateful to each and all three of you. And with that, I am going to allow the Hammer Museum to play us off. Thank you so much, everyone.